I've used Flask for multiple websites over multiple years, and I can still confidently say that it's definitely worth it. However, you need to know a couple of things about it first. There are a few pros and cons about this application that you must know. And specifically, the first con or the first pro would be that it's very easy to learn. At least I would say. That being said, I didn't actually learn any other web framework. I a little bit saw about like Django and things like that, but maybe all of them are easy to learn as well. But it's built in Python, so that immediately makes it way easier because, I mean, you kind of also separate the server side and the client side. And so you know that the server side is kind of like your website's server and the client side is your user, right? And so you separate the code that you build to deal with the user with the code that you build to deal with the website. Anyway, so it's kind of clear that you have the server side with Python and then the client side with JavaScript, right? Which also, by the way, can be a con, is that, you split it into two. So let me just mention that. You split the client and server, right? One is in JS and one is in PY, right? Maybe that's a con, but I wouldn't exactly say that it's a con, but so another con that is very important to know to you if you actually want to use it is the annoying part about Flask Socket.io. So Flask itself is actually a micro framework, if you didn't know. And this thing means that it has other frameworks like that come into it to make it a macro framework, to make it bigger. Flask, there's Flask and then there's Flask Socket.io, right? Like an extension of Flask. And then there's Flask login, and then there's, I don't know, Flask security or Flask WTF, like forms. But anyway, all of this is a problem because of, like, specifically with Flask Socket.io. The issue with this application is that it's very difficult to find a place where it's actually properly supported, right? You already won't find many where people support Flask, like, like a server, a host server that will say, okay, yeah, your Flask website, we can host it to the wide world. But Flask Socket.io is way more difficult to find. Like there's Python Anywhere, right? They support it, but very much in beta features, so it should work fine, right? I've used it before, but it's very like weird that they have this conflict, especially with Python with Flask Socket.io, right? What it does actually is it communicates between the client side and the server side via what's called a WebSocket. And so like it just transmits data. Okay, we send it like an event, right, with data attached to it, and then the client catches that event and then processes the information for whatever purpose. Well, that communication, right? Let's say your user is logging in and then they just write something like, their login information, their email and whatever. They send it over to the server side and then you try to store it in cookies, right? So there's Flask Session, which is another extension that can actually like create cookies on the client side device. Like people say, oh, like websites say like, oh, accept cookies, right? That's what Flask Session can implement. And so the annoying part is that when you send it over, and then Flask Socket.io's event handler accepts that event, like when you code up this event handler, it accepts that event, takes the information, and then okay, it tries to like update the database information, and then it tries to update the cookie, right? To say, okay, now we have this login information, we'll store it in this user's cookie, and it can't change, right? Under an event handler, that's not possible. And at least I have not been able to find it to be possible. And so that's the annoying part, right? You have to find different ways to go about that. Obviously, it's a very minor conflict, but again, it's fairly big in that like WebSockets are very convenient, but you cannot save information through them. And in cookies, it's fairly annoying. But anyway, so that's what you should know. What else? Is that, yeah, you should probably just pay attention to the fact that it's a micro framework. And yeah, that's all that I wanted to say. If you've seen that and you've decided, it doesn't really matter, I'm still going to build it, that's amazing. Or I'm still going to use it as my web framework. That's amazing. Then what is the easiest way to learn it? Well, for me, it was through free code camp, through like just tutorials and uh, docs plus building on your own, right? So this is the best way, I think, right? You first get into tutorials to just understand, oh, how do I, like launch a first website where it just says hello world. And then you look at the documentation and then you look at, okay, there's different functions, features, everything like that. And then you just start building something. You know what? I'm going to try to build something where I can like log in and it's just going to store information. And then you eventually learn and learn. And then you can actually build some kind of project idea, which you probably already have some kind of idea. And then kind of just learn that way. At least that's the way I learned it, and I find that to be the best because, especially when you're building, you don't see that you're kind of pursuing learning, right? You just think, okay, I want to get this project done and I want to build it. But in the process, you learn a lot of new things, and then that's a benefit. In the end of the project, it's a benefit that you see, okay, now I've actually learned a lot of things. That's amazing. Now I actually know how to code in it successfully, and I can say that I'm fluent in it. So, do I recommend it? Absolutely. I've only used it, so I cannot really suggest anything else. But quite frankly, I think it's pretty good. If you're actually trying to build an app in your spare time, though, but you feel like you can't really navigate through building one because you don't really know much about coding and about how to go about it, I suggest you try Stellar AI. It's an assistant that will help you to actually build an app that you're proud of. You can sign up for free right now, and if it actually helps you a lot, that's amazing.